What is the meaning of life? If this question is bothering you and you don't have an answer, it means you're suffering from an existential crisis. Let's talk today about existentialism and tackle the most painful questions of mankind. We all remember our childhood. For many of us, it was a time of simple joys and discoveries. Every bite of a different kind of cake and every new version of a game opened up a universe. Ian Krianga said, "I don't know about others, but when I think of my childhood home, when we boys used to play tag, my heart still leaps with joy." It's normal. When a child is born, he knows nothing about the universe. His brain is like a sponge that eagerly absorbs every experience from the surrounding environment, food, travel, or games. New experiences continue like a roller coaster, and in youth, they become deeper and more refined. Whether we're talking about love, the adventure of human knowledge, or the geography of cities full of history, we read books, explore documentaries on YouTube and computer games, or watch movies that have moved generations of people before us. Human life, as actor Dem Radulescu says, referring to Eugen Ionesco's play The King is Dying, is, however, built the wrong way, upside down. From birth to death, a person undergoes a continuous degradation of the body. Just as entropy increases in the universe, so do his pains and sufferings multiply. And as their weight becomes harder to bear, he inevitably asks himself, "Why do I suffer? What is the meaning of my suffering?" And when the years bring him closer to that threshold from which no one returns, when death begins to take away his friends and parents, he is confronted with the most acute reality of his existence. At some point his life will also come to an end. He is prepared for the great leap. How does he cope with the fear and anguish that his experiences might suddenly end? His childhood memories are growing more vague. He can barely hear the laughter from his childhood games in his distant memories, and he no longer remembers the elders' faces who shaped his youth, having passed away years ago, which now feel like centuries. Then our friend finds himself wondering, without meaning to, what is the meaning of life, and especially, what is the meaning of my life? Philosophically, he's having an existential crisis. Modern society, in all its constructs, tries to hide from us the most obvious and most shocking element of our existence, death. Tolstoy described the above crisis like no one else, in a novella called The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which is worth reading. Ivan is a bureaucrat who lives his life automatically, concerned with his bureaucratic career and the daily events of the society he lives in, seeing death as something that only happens to other people, not to him. One day, he becomes seriously ill and haunted by the specter of his own death, facing the end of his existence. Death is no longer an impersonal topic for small talk at dinners. It is now an immediate reality of his personal existence, a painful certainty that he is forced to face alone. Tolstoy's character has become an existentialist. Existentialists deal with the tragic meaning of life and want to distinguish themselves from the professors at the lectern, who are more concerned with rational explanations of existence. Existentialism is a return to man and his experience, to the tragic aspect of life and the deeply philosophical loneliness of his subjective experiences. "We die alone," someone dear to me once used to tell me. In the existentialist view, the problem of being must take precedence over the problem of knowledge. So we leave aside the formulas and equations of the natural sciences, because subjective existence, as we know it, and especially as a person feels it through their consciousness, cannot be made the subject of objective research. No matter how much we learn about the flow of electrical signals between neurons, we cannot capture in their equations the pain and suffering carried by their messages. We are interested in the person behind the pain and their subjective experience, not the chemical composition of the molecules that transmit the information. That is why, in their search, existentialist philosophers believe that we must return to the person and their subjective experiences. We must confront life's tragic meaning. Because, as my grandmother used to say, where we come from, we don't know. Where we are going, we don't know. All our experiences, good or bad, pleasant or painful, unfold in an ocean of the unknown, and life has a tragic aspect, because the suffering in the world, evil and death are not truly explained, but rather parked in one belief or another, conscious or unknown. The fact that man dies is not truly internalized in society and in his life. Man feels that his life is, in one way or another, painful, and he doesn't know how to cope with these challenges that seem to exceed his power of understanding. Humanity's response to the challenges of human suffering has so far been faith. Faith and the form it takes over time. Religion has existed for a long time, not just recently. It comes from primordial times, from ages when primitive people built the first polytheistic religions. They saw behind every phenomenon or event the will of a god from their own pantheon. Over time, religions adapted to the increasingly sophisticated needs of humans. And today, the planet is dominated by 3 major monotheistic religions built around a creator and several other Eastern religions, where the emphasis is rather on reintegrating man into the universe. All of them, however, seek to answer the great hunger for existential questions of humans. Why do I suffer? Is there something beyond death? What is the meaning of my life? How should I live in a vast world indifferent to my life and the sufferings I carry in my soul? Those who acutely ask themselves these questions, starting from the premise of the existence of God, are the faithful existentialists. Among them, perhaps the most well-known is the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, whose book Fear and Trembling was translated directly from Danish by my good friend Leo Stan about 20 years ago. Kierkegaard says that the only viable way to escape these existential questions along with the anxiety they bring is to leap over the gaps that fill the chasm of ignorance, and to believe in the Christian God not due to rational arguments, but precisely because of the experience's irrationality. We follow the message of the writer Fyodor Dostoevsky, namely that the purpose of life is to always act sincerely and authentically with our own human nature. Kierkegaard advises us to take our existence as created beings seriously and to build a personal relationship with our Creator within Christianity. I will not insist on Christian existentialism. I believe faith in God is a powerful way to ease existential anxieties like fear of death, suffering, or questions about life's meaning and the existence of evil. The condition is, as Kierkegaard says, to take the Christian teachings in Christianity seriously. Life is a balance where eternity depends on us. We must live responsibly and when needed make sacrifices. There are many books that detail this way of life, and if needed, countless monasteries where we can find examples of people who have embraced this way of life in an authentic and responsible manner. Can we confront the painful questions of existence without appealing to a divinity in the solitude of man and his experiences? This is the other type of existentialist. In a way, much of modern philosophy is a way of explaining the world and relearning how to live in a world without God. And here it's not so much about God as the final central authority, but rather the other aspects to which a divinity gives answers. The meaning of life, the existence of an immaterial soul, the problem of death and suffering. Basically, by giving up on God, you don't have to unravel the whole ball of yarn of life from the very beginning and answer those same questions from scratch. But this time, without invoking divinity, how can this be done without God? Fyodor Dostoevsky says, everything is permitted. Simply put, what will be the moral basis of our actions? Is morality then just a simple negotiation between the citizens of this planet? As the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche points out, whose madman, described in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I can almost see him shouting with a lit lamp in the streets, God is dead, we have killed him. Of course, it's not that God was killed. He never even existed. He was an invention of our minds, says Nietzsche. In fact, for Nietzsche. But this is a joy, because the morality that needs to be built will no longer be a slave morality based on shame and subordination, as he argues. It was not the one built by Christianity, but rather of a man mastering his own destiny. From here comes the idea of Obermans, meaning the overman, which I don't see so much as a Hollywood Superman or as the new man described in the communist books I had to study in school. I see him rather as a man who dares to take his freedom seriously, who determines his own destiny, aware of the environment he is in and of his own limitations, especially with all the responsibilities that come with it. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said that we are condemned to be free, the choices are ours with all the responsibilities that come with it. Think carefully before choosing to go to a barbecue where there are some very large, appetizing pieces of meat on the grill. Are you aware of the suffering that animal endured before it died? If you were to experience, even just once, the ordeal of those animals' deaths with all their suffering and pain, would you ever eat meat again? I know people who became vegetarians at this thought and who avoid the supermarket shelves full of meat so they don't have to relive that horrible experience in their minds. Are we truly responsible, Camus asks? Do we truly live up to the responsibility that comes with the freedom of being liberated from God? The consequences of the absence of God are truly traumatic if we look at it from the existentialist point of view. First of all, because we remain lonely beings, living our subjective experiences, joy, fear, anguish, in the solitude of our existence. No matter how much empathy our friend may have, we alone must face self-fear. From this point of view, existentialism is the study of how we are born, live and die alone. For an existentialist, everything begins and ends with oneself. The life one has is the only window into the much richer existence, both in space and time, with which the cosmos has been endowed. The result is that the existentialist creates a separation between himself and the rest of the universe. It may be artificial, but it can lead to an anxious, absurd, and often even desperate perspective. In this case, the human condition can become one of anxiety, resulting from the understanding of his inevitable freedom to have to make a choice, from many possible choices. From the ignorance of the future, which I call the tyranny of the arrow of time, and from the finitude of an existence that was preceded for him by nothingness and ends inevitably in nothingness. Such an approach raises numerous questions. Isn't the separation between oneself and the rest of the universe the one that leads to anxieties? Artificial? What is the self we value so highly? Animals feel pain and suffer, but we believe they don't see themselves as the center of a complex personal drama. I have a cat at home, but I don't think that cat suffers from the inevitability of its own death. Years before that happens, like humans, but what is a human after all? Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, identifies two types of beings, being in itself and being for itself. Being in itself is possessed by objects. An electron, for example, is simply a stone. Likewise, being in itself describes the world of physics. Objects simply exist and are described by immutable laws written into their nature. An electron moves according to Schrödinger's quantum equation, follows Heisenberg's uncertainty principles, and also obeys Einstein's relativistic equations. The electron has no free will. It cannot break these laws whenever it wants. Philosophy, where only objects, their laws and space-time exist. A physicalist universe. Physicalist philosophy, also called materialist, not meaning greed, claims only such objects exist in the universe. In this materialist philosophy, even a human being would be considered just another object, whether he wants it or not. Personally, I am not a physicalist. My own suffering and pain have made me believe that, especially the subjective nature of suffering, is something that exists in the universe in a way that could not be addressed by the mathematical form of physics. The equation might say how a neuron transmits the information of pain, but I don't see how it could describe the fact that pain feels painful. Philosophers say that pain has an extra quality compared to matter, namely the quality of being felt. In their terms, pain is an example of a quale. And man does not simply exist in himself. He is not an object but exists for himself, meaning a different type of being that cannot be fully described by the mathematical equations of the first kind of being, objects, that is, physics. The taste of an apple is an example of a quale. Of course, there are electrical signals that start from the taste buds and reach the brain, and they encode the information resulting from the interaction between the taste buds and the molecules in the apple. However, this information is just a series of electrical signals. Once it reaches the brain, the information is further interpreted by the brain, which gives it a subjective quality of taste. Through an unclear and hard-to-imagine mechanism, the information acquires a new quality, that of taste, which we feel when we bite into an apple. Taste is an example of qualia. In my book, What is the Difference Between a Child and a Laptop?, I argued why I believe these qualia are not illusions, and why I think the subjective world of consciousness is a reality different from the objective reality of matter and a reality that cannot be ignored. In Sartre's sense, our subjective world is an example of being for itself, not being in itself. Objects, therefore, from now on, I will start from the reality of this being for itself. So, of consciousness, meaning that man carries within himself in his existence and suffering a form of existence that cannot be framed within the mathematical description of physical objects. It seems to me that this assumption, far from freeing us from the rigid spectre of materialism and physicalism, raises the problem of our existence to a higher level of complexity and responsibility. What is this additional property of consciousness? What are we? What then is our essence, which becomes different from that of the atoms we are made of? The problem of the essence of things has been debated since Aristotle. He argued that things have an essence given to them before they come into existence. Their existence only serves to validate their essence. The knife, for example, has an essence given by the sharp edge of its blade. This blade, this essence, is what gives it the right to be a knife, what defines it as a knife. Man, said Aristotle along with the other Greek philosophers, also has an essence that his existence brings to life. The essence is what gives him his way of life and his limitations. It seems to me that this philosophy of essentialism is very similar to the game of chess. Here, the essence of a rook is not its shape, as one might think, or the material it is made of, but the rule by which this rook moves on the chessboard. If a rook is missing, we can replace it with a button if needed and continue the game, because that button will take on the essence of the rook and will always move as the rook does. In existentialist terms, essence precedes existence. This is not the case for humans, says Sartre, an atheist philosopher who tries to understand the world without appealing to divinity. When a person is born, they do not have a given essence, so for them it is the opposite. Existence precedes essence, and a person's essence begins to be built by the actions and choices they consciously make. He becomes a good man or a bad man as a result of his actions. He is constantly rebuilding himself. In Nice, from which it is said that Sartre might have drawn inspiration, this argument is found in the phrase, "There is no being, there is only becoming. Man is in a perpetual state of becoming and is never something fixed." It's a kind of quantum argument in which man is defined by a state of probability rather than certainty. Hence all the existentialist stress. As a side note, this closely resembles the description of man in Christianity by Greek theologian Heroteus Vlahos. Through his choices, he says, man can become a person who is deified in the sense that he resembles his creator. The becoming of man, his deification, is the purpose of Christian life. This thought and its consequences shake me every time I remember it, because these things seem too philosophical. I'd like to step back and see where we are. We started from the premise that man is essentially different from matter, not only through the subjective nature of his sufferings and anxieties, but also through the freedom of the choices he can make. Whenever you look at a mountain, a tree, a star in the sky, or a galaxy, remember that you are essentially different from everything that is out there. You carry within you an essence that you build, in Sartre's words, and this essence is something new for the universe. It is something extremely rare and precious. You feel the responsibility of life. You feel that it's no longer just about you and your suffering. How you have received in your bag such a rare element of the cosmos, and how the consequence of this is that you must take your existence seriously and with responsibility. And this, even if you don't believe in God, because you see, faith in God and Sartre's atheism meet in the responsibility and authenticity that each approach tries to have in its own way of existence. Simply put, in both cases, we have to live very differently from a cat that lives mainly from day to day, concerned with its own survival. We have to take our existence seriously, and that demands a lot from each person. Through his existentialist philosophy, Sartre tried to explore the consequences of human life without appealing to divinity. He says being human is hard due to separation from the environment. Through an invisible barrier that separates the world of external objective phenomena from the way they are perceived in your inner subjective world, this is the barrier of personal perception without appealing to a divinity. It's difficult to accept and come to terms with death, which you can't understand or grasp with your mind. How could you make sense of the billions of years before you about which you know nothing? The trillions of years after you, which the universe will live through without missing you? The only thing of value you have, according to Sartre, is actually freedom, according to Sartre. Your choices determine in the truest sense the essence of who you are, and the essence of what humanity will become over time. Your freedom is the gift and the burden of your life. A burden because it's your personal responsibility to determine your essence. Unlike other philosophies where your essence was already decided and your purpose in life was to fulfill that essence. If people have complete freedom, is everything permitted? And then, as Dostoevsky said, how can good and evil exist? What separates them? What defines them? When we want to find out if a car is broken, we take it to the service, and there the mechanic or the car's manufacturer tells us the guidelines by which we check if that car is still good or if it's broken. If God does not exist, who tells us if something is good or bad? We return to Nietzsche. For this reason, he says, the task of the Superman is to determine these values again through a re-evaluation of all values and the criteria by which we make choices. This is one of Nietzsche's major influences on philosophy. The opening of the gates to re-evaluation. There is no God, Sartre would tell us, and we are condemned to take upon ourselves all the responsibility for our actions. All the more reason we need to think twice before doing something that affects those around us. Because we cannot be infinitely free, our freedom ends where another person's freedom begins. From this point of view, existentialists place great value on human freedom. And they believe that Freud's school is mistaken in thinking that our choices are determined by a more or less conscious past. Certainly a childhood in a small town influences our future, but who could predict in what way we might choose to move to a big city or, on the contrary, to stay in our small town near our parents? That is why, says Sartre, the choice is ultimately ours. Moreover, Sartre argues this freedom of choice increased once God was taken out of the equation of our lives. For Sartre, as for Nietzsche, from now on man can follow his deepest spiritual aspirations. He can begin a new life with a potential limited only by his imagination. Always, however, in this philosophy, man must not forget that this absolute freedom he has discovered also comes with an equally absolute responsibility. Which is a frightening thought if we think about it carefully, isn't it? Because the knowledge by which man in general and each of us can make choices is limited. And consequently, there can never be a perfectly good choice that you can be sure is objectively good. This creates the anxiety of navigating a world where you don't know if the choice was the best one. And yet, all the time, this world forces you to make choices constantly. The fact that we don't know the whole truth can, however, be considered an opportunity. Truth isn't just there, it's created by what we do. In this philosophy, searching for the meaning of life is pointless, most existentialists would say. Meaning is built with each conscious choice we make. Is meaning really built with every conscious choice we make? It's not like that for all existentialists. Although the writer Albert Camus doesn't define himself as an existentialist, others consider him one because of his approach and way of thinking. Camus believed life is meaningless. No matter how much we try to build it, life is what it is, with joys and sufferings, without these having any meaning beyond the biological one. Our hand burns from being too close to the fire, so we pull it back. Animals feel pain and suffer due to pain's biological function. However, they do not build an internal complex theater of their suffering as humans do, to the point where the thought of a hypothetical future suffering becomes a suffering in itself. The human brain has an extraordinary capacity to discover and build stories, and these stories, often imaginary, become almost real, with his mind amplifying the suffering. Personal perception becomes the personal story, the story of the self, and the glasses through which we filter the surrounding reality tell us whether an event is good or bad, depending on the effect that event has on the self. Does it hurt or does it flatter the personal story? We suffer, says Camus, simply because we are human, or rather this is what defines us as humans. Suffering, in this light human suffering, and even dreams, seems absurd. Also, where are those dream worlds that we experience so intensely at night? Where are the people I met in my dreams and never met in real life? Where are the elders of our childhood now? Why is life seen like this, a fleeting illusion that takes one form today and another tomorrow? Eminescu spoke of a dream of non-existence and a chimeric universe. Where are we in this dream of the universe? What could be the meaning of our suffering, when the very meaning of our existence and even of the universe itself is impossible to find? Camus' answer is the myth of Sisyphus. Here, the mythical hero Sisyphus is condemned to push a large, heavy boulder up to the top of a mountain, only for the boulder to roll back down again. And so, over and over again, in an eternal punishment given by the gods by all standards, Sisyphus's life is useless and meaningless. Camus says Sisyphus still believes his life has value and seeks happiness in his absurd task. And we, Camus adds, must accept the lack of meaning in our own lives and not try to escape this absurdity of meaninglessness through systems that give existence meaning. This acceptance of life's lack of meaning is at the heart of a philosophical theory called, in English, Absurdism. I don't know if this world has a meaning that transcends our understanding, says Camus. But if it does exist, it will be a meaning that I won't be able to understand, and then how could it be a meaning for me? Here we see the trace of nihilism, defined as the belief that life has no meaning. I've often wondered where our search for meaning in life comes from. I believe that an answer can be found at least partially in the stories our brain is able to construct, stories we discovered in childhood and that continue to fascinate us throughout our lives. These stories are not just a simple sequence of events. Look, I threw a few marbles on the pavement. Let's see what happens and what the consequences are. The stories we're looking for are the ones that have hidden from the very beginning, a teaching, a lesson. The ones where the experiences are personal and hide a meaning from the very first pages, a meaning that is fully revealed only at the end of the story. I think we are forced, by the way our brain is built, to look for meaning in everything that surrounds us. In practice, suffering itself is what creates the greatest need for meaning. Camus' philosophy shocks us by highlighting the lack of meaning, especially in our personal lives. The myth of Sisyphus is a vivid expression of the absurdity of human existence, a living image of man's suffering condition, and the futile search for meaning in a meaningless world built by this philosophy and in a universe indifferent to the sufferings that man endures. We are beings hungry for meaning, but we are abandoned in a universe devoid of meaning, Camus would say. There is no cosmic justice, there is no fairness and no rules. We live an absurd life in an absurd world, says the same Camus. Hard to digest, isn't it? My opinion is that we shouldn't fall into a Sioran-like despair, because the most important thing we know is, as Socrates said, that we do not know to absolutize things. The time when we know so little about the universe, it's premature. Paraphrasing Petre Sciuzia, compared to how much there is still to know in the universe. Today, genius is the brother of the idiot, and when I say that today we know little about the universe, I say this in the full mental capacity of my profession as a physicist, and here's why it's true. Do we know the laws of elementary particles, the ones that govern how the electron moves in the atom and the ones that make stars explode? We know the laws that govern how the stars move in the sky, but we don't know the underlying reality behind these laws that appear to us. Although we've reached the moon, we haven't thoroughly explored the depths of the oceans on our own planet. And although we learn about black hole mergers billions of light years away, we don't know how the simple thought of taking the tram is encoded in neural networks. Have you ever wondered what it means to know? I often think that this encodes classical information. In a world that is fundamentally based on quantum uncertainty, knowledge can be an emergent phenomenon, just as the wetness of water is an emergent phenomenon of the structure of water molecules. Another example of why we are almost terrorized by the arrow of time. We believe that what has been is no longer important, and that what matters is what has been achieved and especially what will come next. Unconsciously, we build an image of the universe in which we will only discover the whole truth towards the end of time, and one in which the ultimate value is an ideal construction of a paradisiacal world also towards this end. But the arrow of time may be, as some physicists say, also an emergent property from the random and microscopic structure of the events that make up the quantum foam of space-time. We stubbornly see the Big Bang as the initial event, the creative element of the entire universe, and the Big Crash as its end. But can we see the evolution of the entire universe as a hypersphere in space-time? The Big Bang represented the South Pole and the Big Crash, the end of the universe, the North Pole. They are special only because that's where the world lines of elementary particles begin and end. However, they might just be points we chose with nothing special about them. Just like the South Pole and the North Pole are chosen only for our human convenience related to the Earth's rotation. In a way, we can take the Earth's sphere and spin it like a ball in space, then declare other points as its poles. In the same way, we can rotate the hypersphere of space-time so that the Big Bang and the Big Crash, the end of the universe, become ordinary events on the surface of the hypersphere. In this case, the moment I'm living right now is just as important as the moment when the universe appeared at the Big Bang. All these observations make me believe that we are wrong when we make absolute statements based on our capacity for understanding, which is human and limited, representative of the time and space we live in, and always changing. Scientific knowledge does not escape this dynamic either, because no matter how much we learn about the universe, our knowledge about it is relative to what will be discovered later. Personally, I don't think we should view existentialist philosophies as claiming to state absolute truths. I see them as a challenge to clarify our deepest thoughts, the fears and anxieties that each of us has when faced with the most unsettling questions of existence, so that we can then make meaningful decisions for our lives. Sartre, for example, can't offer us comfort in the face of losing a friend or the fear of death, but he helps us clarify our thoughts. Because when this happens, we can be a little better prepared for something that essentially no one can truly prepare for. Existentialists, whether believers or atheists, believe that in order to live authentically, we must have the courage to face the idea of our imminent death. With God, which is described. Without God, which is more difficult but not impossible. The Spanish writer Miguel de Unamuno believes, for example, that although our mind tells us that death is the end of everything for us, we must go beyond that and against all evidence. We should believe that death is not the end for us, at least not the end in the raw and primary form that we imagine in the simplicity of our minds. Perhaps our very desire for immortality is, in essence, a revelation of another world beyond. Perhaps the only thing we can do is to live in such a way as to deserve immortality, or at least a continuity beyond the great abyss. The choice of how we live our lives is ours alone. Existentialist philosophy, whether within faith or outside of it, tells us that the choices we make in life are important, and that we must make them with complete sincerity and in the most authentic way possible for us. In other words, to take our humanity seriously with all its richness and limitations. Here we are at the end of this story, a story that took me many days to read and take notes on and an entire day to write. It's no wonder philosophy was not my specialty, although any physicist is a philosopher even without declaring it, because in his readings he encounters problems related to the theory of existence. And more recently in quantum mechanics, from the very interaction between the subjective world of the observer and the objective world of measurements. For this study, I used several books which I'll list in the description and recommend. In addition, I closely followed a study on existentialism conducted by Professor Hazel Barnes from the United States. I'll put the link to it in the description. Until next time, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already by clicking the subscribe button right now. I want to thank everyone who supports us on Patreon and those who become channel members here. I'm Christian Presura, you guys are cool, and I wish you all the best. Goodbye.